Hello, everybody. My name is Sandra Sanchez, and I'm the chair of the Government Committee of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County. Welcome to our JOCO in the Know program, Ask the Experts, What's Up with Voting. Our impressive panelists this evening are Brian Newby, Johnson County Election Commissioner, Holly Weatherford, Advocacy Director of the ACLU of Kansas and Western Missouri, Greg Smith, State Senator and member of the Ethics and Elections Committee, and Tom Sawyer, Sedgwick County Legislator, ranking minority member of the House Elections Committee. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for attending the program this evening. I would like to acknowledge the elected officials in the audience this evening, and I know I saw State Representative Lewis Reese here tonight, Becky Fast, Overland Park Councilwoman, and are there any others? Oh, State Representative Nancy Lusk, thank you for being here. Anyone else? Okay. Next, I would like to introduce the members of the Government Committee who are present this evening. Sue Storm, Jill Quigley, Missy Taylor, and is Mindy Reed here? No. Candy Birch. These ladies help make programs like tonight happen, and we do good things in Johnson County on behalf of the League. Among this group tonight is our State League President, Dr. Dolores Furtado. Dolores. And I'd like to thank all the members of the League who are here tonight for everything you do in our community and our state. Now I'd like to introduce our League President, Roberta Eveslage, to say a few words. Roberta?
I didn't know I was going to say anything. I thought I was waterboarding. I want to welcome you. We're very happy that you're here, and we're very happy with our panel being here. It's exciting to see all of you. You are sure to find out a lot of stuff from this panel. They're very knowledgeable. It's exciting. I just went out to my car to get, we have some buttons. League of Women Voters, not for women only. And so if you're interested in having one of those, you're welcome. What else shall I say, Stu? I did get up this morning reading the 913, Brad Cooper's article, and I noticed that the governor hadn't signed the gun bill, and so I got all excited and tried to put out a message that maybe he wasn't going to sign it. Called the governor, and I found his number, and then I sent a note to Brad Cooper, and he replied back, I just got a tweet that he signed it. So there's nothing I can say about that, except that that'll be an important issue in the campaign. So, thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Okay, this evening I have the honor of introducing someone we have seen in our living rooms for a few decades.
Legally, I must say.
I've shared a few of these things about Dave Helling in the past, so this may be a refresher for some of you. Dave was born in Texas, but thank goodness was raised in Overland Park, Kansas. He graduated from Shawnee Mission West and then went on to Creighton University. His first job as a reporter was with KHAS Radio in Hastings, Nebraska. When Dave finally left Nebraska, he joined KARD-TV as a reporter in Wichita and eventually made his way back home.
It gets longer every year. It gets older.
And joined WDAF-TV as a reporter anchor in 1984. Then in 1999, he moved to KCTV5 as anchor reporter, and most recently is a multimedia reporter for the Kansas City Star, where he provides videos for the web as well as regular contributions to the print edition. So without further ado, I present you this evening's moderator, Dave Helling.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I just say quickly, it's great to see friends again and to be a part of this discussion here this evening. I've been a reporter, as you've heard, for some decades now, and to hear the governor announce the signing of a major bill in a tweet is a tragedy that surpasses almost all human understanding for someone who's been in journalism for a long time. And so I always preface my remarks, and for those of you who've heard this before, take it with a grain of salt, but after tonight's session I will be taking subscriptions to the Star in the back of the room for those of you who don't subscribe to your daily newspaper. Great to be here again. We're going to talk about voting tonight with a great panel of guests who can talk about the current state of play, if you will, of how we cast ballots in this country. I've often said, and I've written this, that the way we conduct elections in this country reminds me of how we remove snow and ice in the dead of winter. Which is to say that most of us don't care about snow and ice removal when it's not snowing or icing. And we don't really like to spend as much money as we need to on snow and ice removal when it's not snowing or icing, because it seems like wasted money. But when it snows, it's the most important thing we spend money on. And when it's time to vote, it's the most important thing that we spend money on, bar none. More important than any other thing we do as a community or a society. And that's doubly important when things go wrong. When the snow isn't removed or the vote isn't conducted correctly, mistakes are the most important things that we have to deal with. So this discussion is extraordinarily important tonight. And in part that's also because we're almost 15 years now after the Bush versus Gore hanging Chad debacle of the 2000. And in reaction to that, and I'm sure Brian and others can talk about this, in reaction to that problem, we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to try and update our voting systems and to get a better handle on how we conduct elections. And yet, I think it's safe to say that many Americans still remain skeptical about the way we count ballots and the way we cast ballots and who gets to cast them and how they're counted. You can still find people who think, for example, that Barack Obama cheated his way to Ohio in 2012, that somehow the ballots were stuffed or that there was some shenanigans conducted in the way those votes were tallied. So it's an extraordinarily interesting, timely, and as I suggest, an important topic, and you're all to be congratulated for being here. So you've already met the panel. Let's start, Brian, on your side, and what we'll do is just to have a little bit of just an opening discussion about what you think the current status of the way we conduct elections is, and we'll start with Brian and go down. What are the main things we should know, Brian, and what are the main challenges or questions or issues that you think face those who are involved in conducting elections as we go forward?
Well, thank you. And I think if this table were round, and this was a country, this would be Switzerland tonight, right here. And, not to say I don't expect that I will have some questions directed about the process, and if I don't know the answer, I'll say I don't know, and then try at least tell you what I think the answer is, because I think there will be a lot of questions about the status of registrations and that sort of thing. From my standpoint, if I just look at election administration, I have an election blog called electiondiary.com, and earlier this year, I guess late last year, I thought of 2014 as the year of the voter, because I think there's a lot of things that are hard right now for voters, and you probably will ask certain questions about them, but from my perspective, they are things like polling places, and the fact that even though we've had school safety issues that have nothing to do with elections, there's a mindset now that schools aren't safe, and therefore it's harder to get them as polling places. It's harder to get advanced voting sites because the economy's better and they're less likely to be available. And we're fortunate in Johnson County to have kind of not have a partisan attitude towards advanced voting. That is something I don't think we appreciate as much as we could, because you look at other communities and it's viewed more in partisan ways. In Johnson County, it's just become a way of life. And we need it because we have issues with polling places. We have polling places change, and so people get moved from one place to another. The mail service has gotten worse, and they want to look at reducing delivery and take out Saturday delivery. That's a big issue for us. So all of those things, and then you take into account the fact that our voting machines, we didn't get them in response to Bush versus Gore. We got them about the same time, so they're almost 15 years old, and there's no money to replace them. This is a national issue, but I think we're going to face it before others. And we're facing it at a time, someone mentioned the 913 section of the paper, and today there was an article about funding for the sheriff, funding for mental health, and raising the possibility that if you're not maybe under the county umbrella, there are some issues about funding. And I'm here to say that we're no different. And even more so, we have the same staff level that we had 20 years ago. You mentioned Al Gore, he just invented the internet 20 years ago. Windows 95 was kind of when it became mainstream. So we have the same staff we had before Windows 95, to put it in some context. So all of those things are big deals. Hard to get election workers. Many of you are election workers, I know. Thank you for doing that. And we have a couple people from our office who are here tonight, Tom Ray and Gina Shortino, who are over there, who are hope to lasso you into becoming an election worker if you want to do it. Those are all the issues for us. To me is, how do we navigate all that change in a way that for those people who want to vote, we can make it as easy as possible. That's the main issue for me.
All right, Holly?
I think the biggest issue is the unknown. We're entering an election cycle. We've got a list of suspended voter registrations. I think the last time I checked, it was 16,000 at the beginning of April. I'm not sure what that number is today. Coupled with that is voter education. I know that the election officials in every county are doing their best with the resources that they have to reach out to these suspended voters and to try to get them to get their citizenship documents in so that their voter registration can be fully processed. But again, and as Mr. Newby just mentioned, that's at the will of the resources. And we know that a lot of counties have been seeing cuts over the last few years, and so there's an unknown there. We're not sure what's being done in counties across the state to reach out to these voters who are on this suspense list. And it's not a party problem. I've looked very closely at this suspense list, and in some districts it's majority Republican, in some districts it's majority Democrat, in some districts it's unaffiliated. So it's not a party problem, it's a voter problem. And what unknown comes with that as we approach these big elections in August and especially in November. I mentioned voter education. I think we still need to be educating voters about bringing their ID with them to the polls, being aware of where their polling places are. In the last elections, we got calls from people who were confused in counties across the state because their polling places had changed. And they were being given provisional ballots. They wanted to vote a full ballot. Some people had conflicting information on their driver's license. When they were showing their ID at the poll, they were being given provisional ballots instead of full ballots. And some of that was a lack of poll worker knowledge about what the law was. They should have been given a full ballot. And so we need voters, us as well, to be educated when we go to the polls, so that we know our rights and that we can assert our rights when we're there and we can vote a full ballot. There's also litigation in the state. There is litigation going on. It's Kobach versus the EAC, and some of that has come down. I think the league's aware of that case. And there is a motion to stay for that case, which would have an effect on the upcoming elections. The ACLU has also filed a lawsuit challenging dual registration, voter registration system. And that case was recently, Kobach tried to remove it to the federal court, and the judge said no, it needs to be remanded back to state court. So that is still up in the air as we approach election season. And so I think there's a lot of unknowns out there. And there's a lot of information gathering that we as advocates should be doing, and there's a lot of educating that we as advocates should be doing as we enter the primary and the general election season.
Senator?
Thank you. I appreciate you all being here tonight. I would kind of echo the last two speakers. There are some unknowns that we have to deal with. There are voter unknowns, and that a lot of voters aren't educated even on the issues. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that we have. The League and other organizations are an organization that can help with that. But there's a lot of people, when you talk to them on their doorstep, that they don't have any idea what issues are even on the table, what's being discussed in Topeka. Town hall meetings that I've held, people are really kind of, wow, I didn't even know that the state government did that. So for me, the big issue is making sure that voters have information so that they can make choices rather than walk into a voting booth and say, well, I like that name, and flip a switch. So to me, that's the top issue. There are other issues, obviously, we deal with in the Elections Committee and the Senate. We talked about several issues over the last 2 years of this session. But quite frankly, there wasn't a whole lot of legislation that came out of the Elections Committee that has, it either didn't clear both chambers or maybe only cleared the committee and didn't even clear a chamber. So there was a lot of discussion. There were people that had a vested interest in the election process that showed up at the committee meetings and testified. I would absolutely love to see people that are voters come up and testify and tell us what they think about things, and we don't hear from them. We hear from the special interest groups and the lobbyists. So that's another problem that we have when we're in committee. We're not hearing from the people that are walking into the voting booth. We're hearing from the people that are trying to drive people to the voting booth.
Thanks, Senator. By the way, just quickly, for those who think that maybe they're not informed enough on the issues, I am taking subscriptions to the Kansas City Star. Just another reminder.
Thank you. You know, I think we've made it too complicated. It seems like as technology grows, we should be able to make it simpler and easier for people to vote, and it seems like we keep putting up more barriers. You know, for example, it seems like in this day and age, the idea of polling places where you have to go to one specific place between certain hours on election day is really outdated. With the technology we have, we ought to just have voting centers. You should be able to go any place in the county and vote. You know, like if there's a polling place closer to where you work, you should be able to just go there and vote. You know, we do it now with advance voting. If you vote in person in advance, you can just go to any of the voting centers and vote. It ought to be that way on election day. That's just one example. But instead of making it easier and simpler, it seems like we're doing the opposite. We're making it more complicated. You know, as the senator pointed out, we did pass a lot of election-related bills this year, but one of them that we did pass, House Bill 2210, is one that makes it harder for people to switch parties. If you want to switch parties, you have to do it. In an election, you have to do it before June 1st. You can't do it between June 1st and the primary. And yeah, it just makes it more complicated for voters. I mean, I don't know why we throw up those kind of barriers. You know, some of the laws we passed in recent years requiring people to show ID to vote or a birth certificate. We ought to at least make it simpler. If we're going to have those kind of requirements, if somebody doesn't have their ID, whether they just don't have it on them or whether they're retired, don't drive anymore, or whatever the reason is, they ought to just fill out an affidavit saying, I am Tom Sawyer, I live at 1041 South Elizabeth Street. You know, I am who I am, that's where I live. Legal affidavit, and if you know, it's the penalty would be a felony if it was wrong. But it should make it simpler. I just think we spend a lot of time making it more complicated. And it seems like as technology gets better, we're making it more complicated, not easier for people to vote. We've got a real problem in this country. If you look at people aren't voting. You know, there's a lot of reasons why voter turnout seems to be going down, and you know, some people are just skeptical that they think their vote doesn't count. It goes back to what Dave Helen was talking about in Ohio and stuff, that people think things are rigged or whatever, but we also make it more complicated. People are busy in their lives every day. We should make it simple and easy to vote. And I wish we'd work on that rather than trying to make it more complicated all the time.
All right, thanks for that, and let's pick up on that. And Brian, you know, things must be comfortable in Switzerland, but you know, we'll get you into the low country. It does seem like it's hard to vote in this country, not just for the things Tom was talking about, but you know, why do we vote on a Tuesday? Why not a Saturday, not a weekend, not open for 24 hours? Why don't we vote, you know, at the same time every year so that there's some sense of regularity? It seems like we move, you know, polling places from election to election. We have so many elections. it does seem like we are asking a lot of people to participate. Tom suggests that's why turnout is down. Do you think that's true, that we make it hard? Some people will make an argument you should make it hard, that it's a civic responsibility, that there should be some level of participation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think some of the things that he said are right. I guess the starting point would be who is we, and who makes it hard, because we react a lot. But one of the things you said is how many elections we have, and I can tell you that at the spring election in 2013, the day after that election, this microphone, I think this is
going. Why don't you use the red one?
The day after the 2013 election, the very day after, we received a call from the city of Overland Park wanting to do a mail ballot election. And I don't think people understand that these elections that are special, they cost money, and the communities are spending taxpayer money to find out if they can spend more taxpayer money. And there could be better planning in that regard. And there were initiatives, I think, in both parts of the legislature to move the spring elections to the fall. And I believe moving them to the fall of odd years would be more predictable. It would make it easier for us to administer. I think it would be better overall. There are other factors that impact things, such as when Representative Sawyer was talking about why couldn't we go vote anywhere in the county? And I'd go further, why not vote anywhere in the state? But one of the factors we have to deal with is the perception that if you don't have results by the 10 o'clock news, something went wrong. And you have to print off the closing reports off every voting machine. And with all the races that we have in an August election, that takes more than an hour. And then if you had people in line at 7, you have to, in the likelihood you would, then you have to wait till they're done voting before you can do that. So you wouldn't even be able to close the polls maybe till 9 o'clock. And so because of that, I mean, that alone is a factor. So there are other things that impact us. I don't know how to get to do we make it harder? We spend our whole time, how do we make it easier? And it feels like it gets harder anyway.
But let's just be clear, Brian, you're right, you might have to stay open until 9 unless you opened earlier or stayed open for 24 hours. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, it doesn't seem like anybody ever sits down and says, how can we fundamentally make it an easier thing to vote, rather than this year we'll move a date, this year we'll move a time, we'll open a little bit earlier, and we sort of piecemeal it rather than, overhaul the way we vote.
Well, I totally disagree here. And partially, if we were open an hour earlier, I don't think that's going to have any factor on how many people are going to be in line at the end of the day. We've looked at advanced voting. We haven't had it open on weekends. If the idea of trying to have it through the weekend is something we've considered, we don't have the resources. And I think it is a huge issue when we've asked for, a modest increase in headcount just to handle all the advanced voting, and we haven't gotten it. And it really is a resource thing. We have 16 people in our office. That's all we have, 16 full-time people. And in elections, we're already about to be scraped from the ceiling. And so, on one hand, you can say that, but I know that we've tried to do everything we can to make it easier, and there's only so much you can do.
It's like snow removal. Now, the reason I asked this, though, Senator Smith, is because you will hear some people say, and as you well know, it's probably aimed at your party more than the Democratic Party, that there's an effort to sort of make it harder to vote, to suppress turnout, that's part of what's going on. How would you respond to that? Do you think your party or Secretary of State Kobach, for example, is involved in an actual effort to shrink the turnout for partisan reasons? Is that a fair criticism or not?
Actually, I'd say that the Republican Party is trying to increase turnout, particularly with moving the spring elections to the fall. We know, all you have to do is look at the turnouts in the archives from the Johnson County Election Office, and spring elections turnout is abysmal. In Johnson County, you're looking at 10% of the electorate that turns out, whereas in a general election cycle, you have over 65% of the voters that turn out. Is someone truly elected by the people if only 10% of the electorate turns out? That's, to me, that's troubling, that people don't turn out for the spring elections. So if there was more of a cyclic thing, like you said, Dave, where people showed up every fall and knew that that's when the election was, it may be easier for that to happen.
But some people would, Tom would argue, maybe the way to do it is do it by mail or by computer voting. That would increase turnout. You know, I mean, are there solutions for 10%, 12% turnout?
I mean, some of the, you mentioned one, well, some things we've offered in the past is Saturday elections, the whole idea of voting centers. You know, we had a bill this year on the, I mentioned the affidavit, the 2260, House Bill 2260, which will allow you to sign an affidavit if you don't have your ID. I mean, there's, and he said mail ballot elections, a lot of things we can do to encourage turnout. It just seems like most of the effort all the time is the other way. You know, we're concerned about issues like the ID and certificates and all that stuff, but I just put up more barriers, and we don't really concentrate on increasing turnout.
And that's what I want to ask Holly about, because I think one of the challenges you made, particularly, specifically against the Secretary of State in Kansas, is that he is pursuing policies that make it harder to vote. Is that a fair way to put it? And you know, explain sort of how you feel about some of the things that Secretary of State Kobach has proposed.
Yes, I mean, the ACLU definitely challenges the theory of rampant voter fraud anywhere in the country, especially in Kansas. You know, there's been stats that have been put out by the Secretary of State's office showing alleged voting crimes. The most recent one I saw was over 200 allegations long, and when you comb through those, I found one that I might be able to stretch to say could have been prevented by photo ID at the polls, because that only prevents one kind of voter fraud, and that's voter impersonation. Now, the proof of citizenship to register to vote, there were, I think, 7 or 8 cases there. And when you comb through those, you do find, I think, some interesting stories where one woman was going through the naturalization process and thought that it was going to make it a better case for her to become a citizen if she cast her ballot. So she wasn't paying attention in her citizenship classes. And another case that we know about was a veteran who went and fought in Iraq. When he came back, he thought that he was a non-citizen. He thought that he had the right to vote. He cast a ballot, and was ultimately recommended for prosecution because of that. When you look at our law, and you look at the proof of citizenship to register to vote law, I mean, that is to preclude non-citizens from voting. It exempts the military from the law, and there's reasons for that. And I would let the real expert maybe talk more about that if anyone's interested. But you don't have to be a citizen to be in the military. When you look at the photo ID law, it allows college IDs to be used at the polls. You don't have to be a citizen to obtain a college ID in this state. So if we're really, really concerned about security of our elections, I would be interested to have some of these conversations around still some of the gaps in the security. But the fact is that our elections are secure, and there are safeguards in place. And I've sat in on meetings of election officials from across the state of Kansas, and I believe that they do try to make it easier to vote. I do believe that they have the best interest of the voters at heart when they're discussing how to administer our elections and regulations that need to be put in place to implement these laws that have been passed. They also share the safeguards that are in place and how they're able to administer secure elections in their counties. So I think that the laws that we've seen pass, specifically voter ID and proof of citizenship to register to vote in Kansas, are solutions that have been enacted in search of a problem that we still have yet to see.
All right, and then talk a bit, just to extrapolate, because there's obviously a great deal of interest in the decisions you talked about, both on the Kansas and the Arizona law and the dual registration. What, are we headed for a nightmare in November, do you think, this year, or not in Kansas?
I don't know. I think it's an unknown. We still don't know what's going to happen with both pieces of litigation. There will be some court dates coming up, probably before the August primary. So there's a lot of unknown out there. You know, if we do have a dual voter registration system, it will be the only one in the country. The last time a state attempted a dual voter registration system was in Mississippi. It was challenged on equal protection grounds, and it was declared unconstitutional. And so, you know, I think it's an unknown. I question how the election officials and the poll workers are going to implement two types of voting, two different kinds of ballots. I think there's just a lot of questions, a lot of unknowns, and so we could see some more problems. We saw problems in the last election cycle. My phone was ringing off the hook all day long from across the state, and I anticipate that we will see some problems no matter what happens come August, and especially in November.
Greg, are you worried about that? Should we be worried as Kansans that we're going into an election season, season confused about the way we cast ballots?
Well, right now, there's not any confusion, Dave. We know what the court case came down with, what the decision was, and that's what we're going to do. It hasn't been stayed. There's litigation in place, but until that happens, we know what the rules are. We just have to follow the rules.
Yeah, do you think the public knows what the rules are? Do the public understand? I mean, Holly talks about getting phone calls. You know, the political reporter gets a lot too. Can I vote? How do I register? What do I need to bring? Who? Again, and Brian, I'm sure his phone rings off the hook as well. I mean, again, it doesn't seem like a great way to run a railroad.
Well, it comes down again to participation and how willing the voter is to educate themselves. There are a ton of resources out there on where to register to vote, how to register to vote, what ID you need, what documents you need. I can think of 5 websites just off the top of my head, let alone pick up the phone and call Newby's office or someone else. It's not that hard to get that information.
But why do you need to go to a website to exercise the right to vote? Tom, let me ask you this. Because people say all the time, well, you need an ID to rent a video. But voting is such a fundamental right. You don't have a right to rent a video, but you do have a right to cast a ballot, and yet it seems like the hurdles are, again, higher than they should be.
Well, of course, I agree with that statement. You know, as a citizen, you have the right to vote, and putting up barriers that make it harder, I think, is the wrong thing to do. But part of the problem in Kansas, at the time, like it's 16,000 people now, by the time we had the hearings in committee, there were 20,000 Kansans who had registered to vote at the DMV offices and still aren't registered according to the Secretary of State's office. Well, we had the Secretary of Revenue come before our committee, and we had a chance to ask him questions, and I had him repeat his answer to this question several times because it was stunning to me, his answer. I asked him, as far as these 20,000 people are concerned, what do you feel their status is? And he says that in his opinion, it's okay that they all vote because all 20,000 were issued driver's license. You know, his bureau said that they're okay with driver's license, but somehow that's not enough for the other state agency. And it's against that complication. You have 2 different state agencies, and we're not really communicating well enough with each other. So I mean, it's another complication, and we've got. Yeah, to me, the result is most of those 16,000 people, I think is where it stands now, probably aren't going to be able to vote on election day, just aren't going to vote. So again, it's something else we do to kind of make it hard for people to vote. In the end, whether it's the intention or not, is it suppresses voter turnout.
One of the things, Brian, that you also often hear in these discussions is that even for people who are confused, don't know, may not be registered, they can at least cast provisional ballots, and you know, then the status of the registration can be checked later. Run us through the provisional ballot system in Johnson County. Do you count the provisional ballots? Do you go back and look at provisional ballots and see if the voters properly cast them after an election is over, or do they sit somewhere, or how does that work in Johnson County?
Well, I can tell you how it works in Johnson County and how I think it would work in all of Kansas, and that is that provisional ballot is issued anytime there is a question about a voter's eligibility at that moment for that election. And provisional ballot is intended to protect the voter's right to vote. And I am proud to say that I have never, anytime I've had an angry voter about any issue, I've never had a voter say that they weren't offered a provisional ballot, ever. And I think that's a testament to our election workers. And the way the provisional ballot process works is, if legally the ballot can be counted, or let's put it this way, if legally the envelope can be opened, we don't know what's inside the ballot, or inside the envelope. If legally that can be opened, it is, and the ballot is counted if possible, has nothing to do with the race, how many votes are outstanding, has nothing to do. If the difference in a race is 1 or 1 million, the provisional ballot, if it could be counted legally, is counted. And so Kansas has a high number of provisional ballots compared to other parts of the country. And a big reason is because people, well, there are two driving factors for us. One is people request an advance ballot and then go to the polls. Another is that people go to the wrong polling place and don't want to go to the correct one. And we've reduced that type of provisional ballot quite a bit. In our view, a provisional ballot to protect voters' rights is good. Provisional ballot when we could have done something to help the voter cast the ballot properly. Without provisional ballot, bad. And so we have reduced the number of people who have cast a provisional ballot because they're at the wrong place. One of the things, though, I would say is in the number of people that's in suspense, because I agree, I don't think people know that category, they don't understand. And I think that the different stakeholders have different understandings. My own opinion, I think the average voter doesn't care. And what we have found when we call people who have registered and they didn't provide proof of citizenship, many times they just, okay, I'll get around to it. I do believe another factor, just so you know, is that that's gone on now for 1.5 years, and people move. And once they move, they're technically registered. We can't just remove them. We'd have to have a piece of returned mail and then go through a process. So of that 16,000 or whatever the number is, I would suggest that at least half of those voters now may not be at that address anymore. That makes it even more complicated. And then the dual registration thing, well, right now people don't understand that. To put it in context, and I'm not in any way advocating that it's okay, but if we had to do that right now, that would affect in Johnson County about 25 voters. So there is a view that it's thousands, because that's how many people are in the suspense list. But that is not these people related to the EAC. 25 would be a mess for us. We'd have to figure out how to have them vote. 2,500 would be terrible. So that would be something we don't want to have to deal with. But right now, I think the senator said, I think that we would be hoping just that we won't have to deal with that based on what the court case is right now.
Yeah, do you think people understand, let's go back to provisionals for a minute. I get calls all the time from people who say they never counted my provisional ballot. They just don't believe that those ballots are ever counted. You're saying that they are. I mean, why would, there is some misunderstanding of how the process works, right, Brian?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's two things. People believe that advance ballots aren't counted unless there's a difference in the race that they matter. That's not true. We give a little sheet every time there's a provisional ballot cast that says, you can call this number to find out if it was counted. To my knowledge, we have not had it. I mean, I can't recall the last time we've had someone call. So if they're calling you, they're calling the wrong number.
They're calling me and they're saying, no, right. No, we put our phone number in the paper every day, so that's why. But what you get a lot is not provisional or not provisional. What you get a lot is they didn't let me cast a real ballot. People, you hear that all the time. But my registration was confused, and so they didn't let me cast a real ballot. People don't think provisional.
I think that's true at times, and it's weird. There's this pendulum. People would request a paper ballot years ago, and now they can't vote on a machine. They feel like there's some issue. It kind of goes back and forth, and that's part of it. And I think part of it is we created that because in our view, we've said, well, if it's in our mind, we've said if it's provisional, they'll have to vote on paper. That's the way we think. And I think we've communicated that to voters at times in advance voting, and hearing the phrase have to vote on paper makes them wonder what's going on. So we've at least tried to change that language, that pattern, to say you can cast a provisional ballot. Because I think some of that doing is on us in the way we communicate it.
Yeah. Let's stay with you for a minute, Brian, because you mentioned paper ballots, and I did cover a lot of the HAVA decisions in Jackson County and other places when, for those who don't recall, the Help America Vote Act, there was a lot of money set aside to help jurisdictions update their equipment. And I think you said earlier you didn't get any HAVA money, or did you get HAVA money from
No, I didn't quite say that. What happened is we moved, my predecessor moved to voting machines. We've had voting machines in Johnson County since the 60s. So, we haven't had paper that long. I mean, it's been that long. And we moved to touchscreen voting machines in 2002. And that was with county dollars before any HAVA dollars were assessed. We have added to that fleet, and we've used some HAVA money to increase our numbers, but it was all a natural course of doing business, not part of HAVA. But you allowed me to think about one more thing I wanted to say. I have great respect for the Secretary of Revenue, But one of the things that's very frustrating to me about the process right now is that we have an obligation under many laws to register voters, but so does the Department of Revenue. And the Department of Revenue is called out in the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. They have a federal obligation to register voters, and I believe, I just would suggest that maybe they're not all in. That's part of the
And
frustration.
why? Just because they don't have the people, Brian, do you think, or is there something political involved in that?
Oh, I don't think it's political. I think that it is, if you go, we can only use anecdotal things in our office when one of us goes to get a new driver's license. But the experience is never the same. And so I think it may be a typical government situation where they're understaffed, underfunded. But I saw a quote once that said, they're in the business of registering people to drive, and we being elections is in the business to register people to vote. That's not fair. They're in the business also of registering people to vote. That is something required by federal law.
And again, just to follow it up, it must, and maybe the whole panel can talk about this, Brian, it must worry you, though, that all of these, for what should be a fairly routine exercise of the franchise, causes so much confusion with the public. I mean, you just said that people don't know what provisionals are. People think that somehow you go through the lists every year and purge, non-voting citizens, or get everybody's address right. That doesn't happen. The Department of Revenue is not doing. I mean, it seems like between the lip and cup, something gets spilled, and it's got to worry you a little bit, doesn't it, or not? In terms of what the public perceives as the efficacy of our voting system.
I don't know, I can't control that. I see what you're saying. My bigger issue is, and it's the thing I said earlier, it's complicated. Voting has become much more complicated. I would say nothing changed in government as much as elections and voting in the 2000 to say 2007 period. I would challenge nothing else in government changed like that. And then we've had our own wave again of photo ID and other legislation, but many states have as well. And all those changes happen, and we're sitting with the same staff. That's what worries me more, is that we are under-resourced ourselves. So my worry is the perception will be that we drop the ball on something, and it's just simply because we truly just kind of run out of resources.
Yeah. Holly, I saw you nodding your head. You want to talk about that?
Well, I'm thinking, as he's saying, that their staff has stayed the same level with the wave of new legislation. I'm also thinking how big this county has grown since that time too, and you're still at the same staffing level, and how much your voter rolls might have increased due to the growth in the county. But to respond, I mentioned earlier that right now, follow-up with the suspense list and some of the voter education has been shifted to the counties. And that's being done at the will of the resources of the counties. And I think that Mr. Newby's made it very clear that they've got limited resources. And so, yes, there's lack of education with voters, and there's confusion with voters, and I think there's a fix for that. And I think we've seen some of these other states that have implemented photo ID laws, and only one other state that's implemented proof of citizenship to register. What they've done is they've paid for it with state dollars. They have educated their voters with state dollars. Most of the states that have first implemented photo ID before we passed our photo ID law, there was like, I don't know, 3 to 5. They spent somewhere between $500,000 to well over $1 million just for voter education. Some of that did also include poll worker training. Our bills carried no fiscal note. So none of our state dollars went to voter education. There were some HAVA funds that was used to educate voters, and you might have seen the Got ID campaign that ran on TV, and I think it also ran on some radio stations, and there were some materials that were handed out at community events. We did not have a strong push to educate voters on these changes. And at the same time, what we have done is we've shifted the burden of proof on the voter. The major changes in making the voter, prove who they are, is intimidating. And I think that it does lead to confusion, it leads to intimidation. And I think some people, I've had the same experiences that Mr. Newby has, where you call people on a suspense list and are like, no, well, I don't know, I'll get to it at some point. And you kind of want to just say, can I come to your house and scan it for you, or take a picture and send it for you? I would like to see more efforts to shift the burden back to the government in some situations. In implementing especially the photo ID part of the law, the Secretary of State created various affidavits for people who found themselves, and think of it sort of as like a little flow chart as you're trying to get to the point where you can get your ID. In many areas where people might hit a roadblock and they didn't have a solution, there's been an affidavit that's been created, and they sign this affidavit and then they can have access. You know, like Representative Sawyer said, there's legislation out there that when people don't have access to a photo ID or they can't get one, or they don't have access to a birth certificate and they can't get one, let them just sign the affidavit, shift that burden back to the government, let them vote the full ballot, and then it's on the election officials to prove that these people aren't who they say that they are. And then two, I think we've got to fund some voter education. I think there's going to be more confusion as we go into this next election cycle, because more people, I think, are starting to hear about voter ID laws and proof of citizenship laws, if not in Kansas, around the country. I think we got to educate voters. Once they feel confident in casting their ballot, I think then they're going to be hungry for that information so that they can make the right choice. If it's making the right choice on the elected official that they're voting on, or on the tax question that they're voting on, or the constitutional amendment that they're voting on, I think we've got to instill that confidence in our voters so that we can increase voter turnout and we can have an informed electorate.
And it sounds like, Senator Smith, that what we are hearing is we need more money. And maybe, but you know, you are the guys with the purse strings. Is this something you want to spend money on? Think we should spend more money on to help Johnson County, other counties, you know, in voter outreach and to improve their, you know, mechanisms for voting? Or is this a hard sell in the legislature?
Well, anything that costs money is a hard sell in the legislature.
That can't be, because the Brownback tax cuts, this torrent of money is now coming into the state.
Yeah, well, we could talk about the tax cuts and how successful they've been if you want to.
Okay. We will have that discussion, I'm sure, at some point. But anyway, talk about money for elections.
Money for election, I mean, the budgeting of that money is obviously done by the legislature. It's done in appropriation, it's done in Ways and Means. By the time that bill comes to the floor of the House or the Senate, the hard work, the nuts and bolts of what goes where has pretty much been done at the committee level. That's part of the process. You have to rely on the committee to do what they, you know, do their job and do it right. Allocating funds to run the government efficiently is by far one of the things that we need to do. But my idea of efficient, your idea of efficient are probably not the same.
Right, or what, you know, enables the most number of people to vote at a given time, which is, I think, what we're talking about here. Tom, talk about that a little bit. Is there an appetite in the legislature to either raise money, to set aside a mill levy maybe for counties to raise money for elections?
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting. The reason those bills pass with no funding is that's the only way those bills would pass. You know, when the voter ID bill was originally with the legislature, it took several years to get it passed. But you know, if it had a large price tag to it, so we'll do it. We have to do voter education with it. It would have never passed. I mean, it's probably passed anyway with no fiscal.
And why do you think that is?
Well, again, the appetite isn't there to spend the money on that issue in the legislature.
So when we talk about the things we talked about here tonight with Brian and everybody else in terms of the difficulty, the low turnout, the confusion, distrust of the process, the people who are elected to oversee that process have no real interest in making it better, it sounds like. Is that what we're hearing?
Well, I've been frustrated. I've been frustrated over the years. It seems like as technology gets better, we should be making it easier for people to vote. Like I mentioned voting centers, you mentioned Saturday voting. There's a lot of different things we could do to make it so much easier for people to vote. And instead, we spend our time making it more complicated. And then, like I said, we underfund it so people don't get a chance to get educated.
In the last 5 years, or 2002, 2007, right, the most change in any part of government. Some of that was a reaction to Bush Gore, right? And so we said, okay, let's do all these things, and now it's even worse shape than it was before, arguably. Is that right?
I don't know about worse.
Go ahead.
But I do think that my own view on the dollars, the funding, it's a local funding thing, and counties fund it, and it's not a, I mean, it'd be great if there was state dollars, I guess, but I really wasn't advocating that. I think you can look at where Johnson County has chosen to spend money and not spend money, and there is a provision in the statutes to have a special line item for elections on your property tax bill, which I think would be great. I'm not suggesting an increase, I'm just saying it would be great if it was called out separately.
So people would know.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and I think that would be good. Now, one of the things that everyone in here I would encourage you to do is you can go to jocogov.org, and there's a budget simulation that's going on right now, and you can look and see how you might allocate dollars. And my frustration I have on that is elections is one of the very first things, so you might start trimming that before you ever got down to other things that I might trim. And yet, that would be a good thing to do, is to go there and do that. But it's local. It's not a state thing. I mean, but I agree, even on outreach, we got, in 2008, we got $180,000 to do outreach to make sure people got to the correct polling place. That was the most money the county, to my knowledge, up until then, had ever spent on any outreach effort, not just elections. And we've never had, we don't have an outreach budget now. We have zero.
Yeah, but don't just, Brian, let's be a little bit fair and clear. While, you know, no one would doubt that we could spend more money in this county to improve election outcomes, Johnson County spends more on elections than other counties in this area. I mean,
I don't think that's true.
Well, I think that, I mean, let me put it to you this way. If you go to a Johnson County polling place at a major election, you'll see 15 touchscreen machines, or it did at one time. You go to Jackson County, Missouri, 1 optical scan machine, 1. Because they don't spend as much money as Johnson County does. I mean, that's just, I mean, I've been to them, I've covered both of them. So, it's not like we're in complete poverty here, right? Is that fair to say in terms of how we conduct elections?
Well, first of all, I don't think you've ever been to a polling place with 15 machines.
Well, I counted them. I actually counted them because I covered all the HAVA stuff. And one of the things that came out of Bush Gore, as you know, is equal protection in voting systems. And it's very clear, it was at the time, that the way Johnson County conducted elections was very different from the way they're conducted in Jackson County, Missouri, right across the state line. In terms of access, accuracy, I mean, you know, I was interested because the court said you have to count votes equally, and it's clear we don't in this country, so that's why I count.
Well, it probably was an advanced voting site, though, because we've never had 15 at a polling place. But they might have moved. They might be there on wheels.
There's a church over on 87th Street. We'll talk about it.
However, those machines are 15 years old. And I agree with you about maybe the perception, certainly, that in Johnson County we've addressed things differently. But if you go and look at, say, Kansas City, Missouri, they have electronic poll books. We don't have that. I think we live a bit in Johnson County on our reputation as opposed to current spending. And so I agree, if you've done that in the past, you could draw that conclusion. But if you kind of did a snapshot again, you might see that money's being spent elsewhere more.
Great. Let's go back and, to the 2 politicians, and then Holly will come to you. I think there is some confusion in this group or in this community about the changes that were made in the primaries and the registration deadlines. Greg, you want to go through that a little bit in terms of the legislation that did pass this year and what implications that has for August?
Yeah, you're talking about the party switch?
Yes, party affiliations.
I mean, the change was that you cannot switch your party affiliation from June 1st until the primary election is certified. That's the only change that happened. You could, if you're unaffiliated, you can still come in and declare and vote that party if you want to, and you can change parties up until June 1st, and you can change parties after the election's been certified.
What was the reason for that legislation? Why do we need that?
Primary reason from the proponents of the bill that testified in the Elections Committee in the Senate was they felt it was unfair manipulation of the system. The integrity of the party system needed to be kept in place. If you're a Republican, then vote Republican. If you're a Democrat, vote Democrat. Don't switch to one party or the other to try to influence the outcome of their election just because you don't like what's going on.
Tom, do you agree with that rationale? And by the way, just as long as we're comparing this again to Missouri, there is no party affiliation when you vote. You grab a ballot of either side, but it's not recorded. You don't have, so Kansas is a little different from Missouri in that respect.
There's a lot of states now that don't have party affiliation. You know, I think anybody ought to be able, I mean, the idea of voting is, again, I think it's the right of citizenship to help decide elections. And, you know, in a lot of parts of the state, you're not really sure who the candidates are going to be. So, what law we passed is the filing deadline is June 1st. So now, once you know who all the candidates are, you won't be able to switch parties. So if you're in an area where there's no primaries in your party, but there is in the other party, and there may not be a general or a competitive race in the general, the election's decided in the primary. So you all of a sudden now you have no say in who's going to be your elected official. So I think that's wrong. I think voters ought to have the ability, you know, to vote in whatever election they want to vote in. So the interesting thing about this law is I'm not quite sure how they're going to implement it this year, because the law says that you can't switch parties after June 1st, but the law this year doesn't take effect till July 1st because publication of the statute book. So it's going to be kind of interesting. I assume this year.
Do you think there's a lot of party switching that goes on for strategic reasons, Tom?
I think
is this another problem in search of a solution?
I think there may be a small number of people that do that, but again, I think it's way overblown, and I think even if.
What's the chances of confusion at the polls in August, though? A lot of people are going to show up and go, wait a minute, I won on a Republican ballot and I didn't change it. I mean, that's going to be...
Again, there's more confusion. And we keep, every year we just create more confusion and make it more difficult for people. I mean, I think the long-term result, I think, of this bill is instead of striking the parties, I think it'll weaken them. I think more people will just register unaffiliated, because that way they're unaffiliated, they can go in and grab whatever ballot they want.
Let me just, sort of a personal thing. I've often quarreled with the whole idea of the state running primaries just as a philosophical matter. It's a party decision to pick candidates. Why should taxpayers have to pay for that? Let the parties pay for that.
Yeah, that's right.
Let the people who actually want the candidates. And that was driven home to me because I did a story on the Libertarian primary for governor. There are 2 candidates in the Libertarian Party for governor. They are not allowed on the primary ballot in Kansas by law. So they have to pick their gubernatorial candidate by caucus, which I think is this week down in Wichita.
Yeah, all the smaller parties in Kansas.
Yeah.
We've had different ones come and go.
So the Republicans and Democrats have in essence carved out their own protections in primary law and then had taxpayers pay for it. That always has struck me as a little wrong.
Yeah, well, again, that gets back to what I'm talking about. If it's going to be a state, if you really want it to be a party function, if you really want just the party regulars to choose the party candidates, then that's the way it ought to be done. It ought to be paid for by the parties. It ought to have party precinct people conventions. But, many, many years ago, in Kansas, many other states decided that primaries are important in terms of the final result in the public election, and the public ought to be involved. And that's why laws like the one, like House Bill 2010, it was so wrong, because this is the public interest, and anybody ought to have the ability to vote in those primaries. If somebody, we're taking away people's right to choose who ultimately is going to represent them, whatever level it is at. And I think that's just totally wrong, because we have decided, we made a public decision that it is of the public interest to have primaries funded by the government, so that everybody can be involved. And now we're closing those doors.
Holly, we've talked a lot about confusion and voter concern, and there are some who might argue the ACLU contributes to that by suing all the time on these issues and others. Is this something we should be litigating all the time, or should we leave it to lawmakers to decide what's the best way of exercising the franchise?
Well, before I go there, since we are comparing to Missouri, I just wanted to point out that when Missouri's been considering their photo ID only bill, because it is a state mandate, they have also attached a fiscal note of over $1 million to pay for voter education with that bill in the state of Missouri.
Can I just throw this in too, so people don't think I'm just promoting Missouri completely? Their early voting is horrifically bad. I mean, it's terrible. They don't even have no excuse absentee ballot. So, and again, my fascination has always been the implications of equal protection rights in that context. Because we vote in different ways, we have different systems, different counting. Missouri has a horrible problem with poll workers. I mean, Brian talked about the problem here. You know, very complicated, difficult systems in Kansas City and Jackson County, you know, people who don't understand it. So it just seems to me like the goal of everybody casting ballots the same way equally is we fall far short.
So to answer your litigation question, you know, yes, the ACLU has a litigation arm, and we have filed multiple lawsuits around the country challenging laws like requiring photo ID at the polls or proof of citizenship to register to vote. The only piece of litigation around voting rights that we have in Kansas is a challenge, an equal protection challenge to a dual voter registration system. But what I will say is that we invest equal, if not more, resources in Know Your Rights education for voters. The last election cycle, we invested a significant amount of money in Southwest Kansas to do a Spanish-speaking voter education campaign. And that is not unique to the state of Kansas. The ACLU does that across the country and joins together with partners like the League of Women Voters in voter education campaigns. And currently what we are doing right now is looking at what can we do in Kansas around voter education? Where can we invest those resources most effectively this election cycle with the changes in our elections law, looking at voter turnout around the state, looking at the suspense list and where those people are concentrated around the state, and really trying to determine, you know, how can we get the most bang for our buck, if you will. Really hit the ground, educate voters, get people fully registered to vote so that everyone can vote a full ballot this November.
Do you have a sense that these issues we've talked about tonight are compromisable, that if we all got into a room and had a good conversation with people of good faith on both sides, that we could reach some more fuller understanding of how people can exercise the franchise? Or are we going to have these sort of battles, you know, year after year over, you know, early voting versus voter ID versus, you know, a motor voter, all the other things we fight about, that Brian has talked about being a problem over the last decade? Do we have another decade of that ahead, do you think? Or is there some consensus being reached that maybe we need to do a better job?
I hope not. I hope that there is some room for compromise on future issues. I don't know, since those of us that advocate on the side of the issue opposed to restrictions like photo ID at the polls and proof of citizenship to register, and we believe that there is absolutely no voter fraud that needs to be addressed with such state mandates like those two barriers. I don't know that there's any compromise there. I am encouraged that Kansas and that the legislature has not gone as far as, for example, Florida has. The attacks on early voting in Florida is horrific. And I've been really encouraged that our legislature hasn't gone there. So I'm hopeful that in the future there might be ways for everyone to work together and look at ways to make early voting more accessible and easier. Now that we, you know, have these so-called security measures in place, is there something that we can do to improve early voting in Kansas? And is there, I'm hoping also there's some compromise in the future, because I think it's vitally important, around voter education and poll worker training, and not leaving all of that onto our counties when we know that they are strapped for cash today.
Tom, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. There have been times in the past when we have come together. One good example, we keep talking about early voting, was 1996, when we decided to pass the early voting laws in Kansas. Before 96, Kansas laws would be like Missouri. The only way you could vote early, the only way you could get advanced ballot even, was that you had to have a reason. You had to be sick, disabled, out of the state, whatever. You know. Well, we changed those laws in 96 to no excuse early vote, advanced balloting. Then we initially played the early voting with just Sedgwick County and Johnson County. We're the only two counties allowed. It's kind of an experiment to see how that worked, and then that worked well in both those counties. Then we opened up to the whole state, and you know, hopefully we can do some of those kinds of bipartisan things again in the future. You know, one of the things I talked about earlier is voting centers. And before Ron Thornburg left office, he and I had a lot of discussions about that. He was very open to that idea, because other states are going to that. You know, getting rid of this idea that we're tied to one polling place. You know, let's have voting centers in the county. People can vote wherever it's most convenient for them. Unfortunately, he left office and things have changed, but hopefully, again, down the road, maybe we can move down that path. I mean, do some things that will make it easier for voters.
Brian, let's say you were in the room and everybody was asking you what, I mean, you were the king of the world. What changed? Is it just money? Or are there rules and laws that you think should be changed? Or that you would tell the legislature, these are fertile areas for compromise to improve some of the situation we discussed?
Well, I do believe one thing that this time has come is to move, I do believe, moving spring elections to the fall. And I think that what we've seen come out of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration is a recommendation, and we pushed for it in Johnson County to get them to recommend that there be a school holiday for voting. And in order to do that, then what we would have is we'd have in August where kids aren't in school, and then November when school was out, and we'd be able to use schools for polling places. And so at least we would have a very consistent way people could vote. And that's, to me, is an easy thing that this is the right time to do that. I like the idea of being able to do vote centers. I think that we'd have to look at some laws to be able to speed up the way we get results out of it. And I think we'd have to make sure we have the funding to be able to do it. I think that I'm becoming more and more of the mode that there's got to be a way to do internet voting. And I see all the risks related to it. I think that there's going to be a day some state legislature just says, internet voting, deal with it. And all of a sudden, all the scientists who've been saying it's a problem are going to not have a say in it. And I would like to look at that. I think also, probably, by moving the elections, we'd have fewer special elections. And that is a big deal. I mean, elections are expensive, and by having extra elections, taxpayer dollars for, just as I said, to decide if you can spend taxpayer money, just seems odd to me. And I would probably try and minimize those.
Yeah, we had that, you know, we had the translational tax over at Jackson County last year. And the excuse for putting that on the ballot was, well, it's our turn to go on the ballot. The election cost $1 million just to administer. Just to administer.
Well, and I can only tell you that nobody knows when the elections are going to happen, let alone elected officials. And in my very first year, I was talking to one of the county commissioners who I'd worked with in Shawnee when I was on the city council, and he said, hey, we're going to have to put this question on school funding on the ballot this November, and maybe this August. And I was like, this is 2005, we don't have an election then. And as a result, the county spent $600,000 to have a special election because they didn't plan out that timing. So even the people closest to it don't know those things.
And we may have another vote here on that issue soon.
I'm curious, since he mentioned, there are different bills dealing with moving the spring elections to the fall. Just on the House side, we have House Bill 2226, which would move them to August, November, the even years, and make them partisan. So they'd be the same as, it would, from a cost standpoint, would save a lot because you're limiting elections. Then we have House Bill 2227, which would move the elections to August and November of the odd number year, so the opposite of the other, and keep them nonpartisan. Do you say you'd support both of either one of those, or just 2227?
Yeah, the odd years.
Someone lock the door, we're going to work this out here.
The even would just be much more expensive. I mean, that's the thing is, the even you would take your highest turnout election and combine it with your most complicated election, which is your local election, because you have candidate rotation, and the number of ballots you'd have to print, different types, it would just be too outrageous. So the odd seems to me to be a great idea, because then you get people the pattern of every November I vote, every November. And so I prefer odd.
But just, again, my stupidity is profound. Brian, why do we still, in this era, print ballots? I mean, that sounds like a kind of a silly question, But aren't we moving to a time where we don't? Well, I mean, one of the expenses is printing lots of ballots. I mean, you know, I work for the newspaper, and so the print medium, as we all know, is under some pressure. So can't some of these cost considerations be addressed by new technology, smarter technology, better technology?
Well, in that case, for us, the only way would be the internet, because you can't have a mail ballot election or mail ballots without printed ballots, and the postage is as great of an expense as anything. So that's why we have to print all those to be prepared for all those mail ballot things.
I'm not criticizing that specific thing. I'm just saying that it seems like one of the answers to what we've talked about tonight is a greater focus on, you know, robust technology and the improvements of the 21st century to make the voting process, not just voting, registering, all the other parts of it more seamless, more 21st century than, say, you know, 1950s.
Well, I do think Kansas is one of the front runners in terms of having online voter registration. That was a good thing. I do believe the technology to consider, I mean, I have my own thought, if possible, you wouldn't buy voting machines. You would, 55% of the people, I just saw a stat yesterday, who are 55 or older have a smartphone. So now your older population, the majority have smartphones. Many of us use iPads and have other devices. If we could make that our voting machine, in essence, not spend money on voting machines. Maybe people come in, even has the ability to print off your phone. I think that's a good idea. Now, there are certification issues and there are other factors that get in the way of that, but that's what we're advocating, because if a new voting system is going to be about $12 million. So if you could avoid that, kind of take the IRS page on their playbook and say, you know, we used to get books in the mail of all our tax forms, and now we all buy tax cut software. So they push that cost to us. And I think if we could do something similar in the election world, that might push technology. One of the things is money. I mean, technology changes happen when there's money. And if you go around the country, you're going to hear that no one has money to buy new voting systems. However, we also know that they're going to fail. And so even though nobody has this money, it's going to get spent. Somewhere it's going to happen within the next 10 years, there is going to be money somehow to buy voting systems. And when that money starts being spent, I think we will see a lot of new technological changes.
And isn't that why it's so important for the public to have a robust confidence in our election systems? Because if they're not confident, if they don't think provisionals are counted, if they don't think their registrations are always right, if they don't understand how voter lists are purged, if they're confused about party registration, to go to the public and say we need millions of dollars so we can vote by the internet the same way we signed up for the Affordable Care Act, it's going to be the public. It's not the experts, right, Brian? It's the public that has to have confidence in these new technologies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's why I asked earlier if you and others on the panel, maybe we could sort of have closing comments as to whether we should be worried that, as I said in my opening remarks, for reasons that we've identified and some we haven't, that the public still seems to lack some confidence in the way we run elections.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, speaking after 2011, when we got the SAFE Act, and I went around the state and I was talking to people about what's in the law and what does it mean for you. It was overwhelming. I mean, people's face would sort of freeze and their eyes would glaze over. And it seems as more unknowns pop up and more issues pop up, it adds to that confusion. And then you mentioned voter purging. And that's another issue that's come up. People don't understand how they get purged from the voter list. Or not purged from the voter list. Now...
Just so we know, there are hundreds of thousands of voters who are registered today who are no longer with us.
Absolutely.
Right? Or have moved or have left this mortal plane.
Yeah, Kansas runs the interstate cross-check voter registration program. And I think that the Secretary of State reported in both the Senate and the House Elections Committees that they found 120,000 Kansans that had duplicate registrations in another state. And so, absolutely. I mean, when we move, we might switch our magazine subscriptions and switch our water, but we don't switch our voter registration.
Well, I wrote a column on this a couple months ago, but we get at the Star every election a card from the Kansas City Election Board with a gentleman's name and the Star's address. And you know, we've thought about going down trying to cast a ballot as that guy. And realize
that would be voter fraud.
Senator Smith is, you know, very a law and order guy, and he'd be happy to see a reporter in prison stripes, so we don't do that. But and frankly, a lot of people would be happy to see me in prison stripes. But that's a problem too. We have very outdated, very antiquated voter purging systems throughout the country. Correct?
Right, and I'm not sure. I mean, it seems like Brian said, you know, Kansas is on the cutting edge of internet technology. You know, listening to this interstate cross-check program that has grown, I think it was started under the previous Secretary of State and it's grown under Secretary Kobach. You know, it's an interesting way to purge. We're not sure exactly how many of the 120,000 have been purged. But then, you know, there's other systems in place to purge voters. And then there's a process that they go through before they can purge, and that creates a lot of confusion too. And I know that that's the best that you know, our election officials can do. So like when Mr. Newby said they get a return piece of mail, and then there's a process that they go through to find where that person lives. I've gotten calls from college students who are, you know, terribly confused because they'll go and they want to find their polling place or make sure they're registered, and it says they're inactive, and oh my, they haven't been purged yet, but oh my goodness, what does that mean? Are they trying to take away my right to vote? And I'm like, well, no, it's, you know, probably because you've moved or they've gotten a return piece of mail. There's just a lack of education. Voters don't understand how the system works, how the voter registration system works. They don't always understand election administration, and then obviously the voter purging.
So Tom will go down the other way. So what are we to conclude or to draw as lessons from our discussion here tonight? That things are a mess and never get fixed, or that there are people of good faith who think you know, that whatever challenges we have can be addressed, or that maybe it's overblown? You'll hear people all the time say, hey, voter fraud isn't a problem. And really why we think turnout and confusion is a problem, the vast majority of the public, if we went out and grabbed 10 people on the street, say, hey, do you think voting is a problem? They'll probably say no. You know, they may not vote, may not care. Maybe it's overblown.
Well, it is frustrating, having been involved in the process for a long time, seeing how it has just become more complicated over time. It's, you know, again, I mentioned when I started this, now technology increases, it should be easier for people to vote. We should be making it simpler and easier. And we've had a little bit of success over the years, like '96 with the early voting, advanced voting, but it seems like we spend too much of our time and effort throwing up roadblocks, and we need to quit doing that. It's interesting to me. We make, you know, it's the state of Kansas that issues a driver's license. It's the state of Kansas or whatever state you're born in that issues your birth certificate. Yet we make the individual try to prove to the state that, you know, they have their driver's license or their birth certificate. We have all those records. I mean, we got them. So this technology today, it seems like we should not be putting that kind of burden on individuals to come up with that stuff. I guess I do, although, you know, I do remain optimistic that, you know, we can make some progress. Hopefully we'll get to the point where we'll stop throwing up roadblocks or making changes. Like, I mean, again, we made it more complicated. Again, people are going to be confused whether they can switch parties or not. I mean, just that bill passing is going to be confusing for voters. Hopefully we can start going back the other way again and start working on some things, whether it's Saturday voting, whether it's open up the voting process for several days and you can vote anywhere, voting centers, or, you know, just some things to make it a little easier and maybe keep things the same for a while so it won't be so confusing. Because, you know, in a way, you know, I'm always concerned voter turnout is low, and we ought to be you know, our goal should be increasing voter turnout. Instead of concentrating, you know, even, you know, the Secretary of State has spent a tremendous amount of time trying to find voter fraud. I mean, this guy wants it, you know, this is the huge effort, and the few cases he's able to come up with. I mean, you think about the millions of votes that have been cast in this state, and all the different races. I mean, we're talking about the percentage of these few cases he comes up with is so small, it's, you know, a millionth of a percent, and it's huge. It's tiny. So it's a non-issue, but the fact that people aren't voting is a big issue. And that it becomes a bigger issue each year. So it's like fewer and fewer people voting, and we don't help when we make it more complicated. We don't help when we make it more confusing. We need to try to make it simple. And we got to make it as simple as possible, make it easy for people to vote, and encourage people to vote, do more voter education, and hopefully we'll start working towards that again and work together on it.
Ray, you want to talk, you're on the committee, talk to us a little bit about what lessons, what things can we learn, where do we need to be a year, 2 years, 10 years from now?
Well, the committees, for that matter, the whole legislature, I think, their number one goal is to not necessarily increase turnout, although that's a byproduct. The number one thing we want to do is protect the integrity of the voting system and make sure that we don't have fraudulent votes and that we don't have people voting that shouldn't be voting. Let's face it, I teach history and I teach American government in the high school. And if you look at Kansas history, our first constitution passed because of voter fraud. 3,000 people that came over from Missouri in a town that only had 355 people to vote had over 3,000 people vote for the Constitution, and obviously voter fraud when you have...
Apparently they did not have voter ID from Missouri.
They didn't have voter ID, they didn't have anything, obviously, back then.
They didn't have driver's license because cars didn't exist.
Exactly, exactly. And back then you did, you signed something, and that was it, but you also got a colored ballot, everybody knew who you were voting for, too. So there wasn't a secret ballot. So yeah, secret ballot is a huge thing now. But the integrity of the system is something I think is important. And then the other thing is to realize the legislature is not designed for rapid fire changes. That is not the purpose of the legislature. The purpose of the legislative system is to stop legislation from passing, not to make legislation pass. If we change things every year over and over and over again, then there really would be a lot of confusion, even more than there is now. But the legislature is not a fast-moving machine. It's not designed to be a fast-moving machine. And even these changes that we've talked about tonight didn't happen in one legislative session. They happened over time. So people can become aware of these things if they avail themselves of the resources that are out there. And that, I think, takes me down to the last thing is there's a lot of apathy. You even brought it up, Dave. We could walk out on the street and grab 10 people, and they're like, I don't know, I don't vote, I don't care. And we see that when people are contacted to say, hey, you need to come in and do this or your ballot's not going to count. Yeah, okay, whatever. So that's a huge problem. And I don't know how you fix that. I don't know how you fix the perception that people don't care if they vote or not. And I think that's probably the biggest problem we have over anything.
Holly, you want to talk about what's a takeaway tonight? What should our audience take away in terms of where we are and where we need to be, in your view, again, a year, 5 years, 10 years from now?
I think that we need to be addressing the voter engagement problem. And I think that the we is a cumulatively we. It's advocates, it's voters, it's community members, it's election officials, it's elected officials. And I think one of the ways that we do that is we meet people where they are. So I'm really encouraged hearing Mr. Newby's talk about technology, because that's where our country's going. People always have their face in front of a phone or some sort of electronic device, but we also know that there's people that don't have access to those kinds of electronic devices. And so we've got to figure out how to make good proactive policies that moves, I think, with the country, but we're also paying attention to all the different populations of voters and the different socioeconomic backgrounds that our voters come from, and making sure that we're doing good policies that meet each individual voter where they are, and we can try to bring them into the system and then engage them in their civic duty of casting a ballot. I think we just have to, and I think I'm piggybacking maybe on what Representative Sawyer said, I think we've got to shift our mindset in the legislature out of the playing defense and, protecting from illegally cast ballots. That's just not a significant problem. There's, all sorts of terms thrown out there. You're more likely to get struck by lightning or bit by a shark in Kansas or whatever. But what we do know is a significant problem is voter apathy, voter turnout, voter engagement. And I think we've got to quit playing defense. We need to start playing offense in terms of the policies that we're passing and figure out how to bring more people into the system.
For the record, by the way, my My house was struck by lightning 2 weeks ago, so it does happen in Kansas. Or at least it was close to my house. It blew up enough of my electronics to get my attention. Okay, Brian, to sort of wrap us up, what do we need to think about as we leave here tonight about what you do? And if you want to make a pitch for the bond issue for the new election machines that we need in 2016, feel free to do so, or any other takeaways that we need.
Well, I think the others have been talking about 5-10 years from now. And if you wanted to see something change, you would have a forum like this and not have it be held by the League of Women Voters 5 to 10 years from now. You're a stakeholder group. This is an obvious thing of interest here. But there are fewer people here tonight that would be here if it was a not in my backyard zoning issue going on, or Google Fiber was coming in. And so that is a big deal, I think. The President's Commission on Election Administration, I was in several of the meetings with them, and I came to a sad realization that the audience for their report was viewed differently than it should be, because they didn't have anybody from counties on this committee. They had only election people, which was great, but it's viewed as election issues are election people's problems. And until that is viewed differently by the people who really control purse strings, that's how it's still going to be. And the problems we have in Kansas really aren't any different than elsewhere. I mean, we've got some unique things potentially, but the issues that we face are the same issues that are faced in many other states. And Representative Sawyer talks about a great thing that happened, and that was advanced voting in 1996. That happened after a catastrophe, really. If you look at how we had long lines in 1992 for the presidential election, and that was the triggering point for advanced voting. Well, I would prefer not to have a catastrophe. And I have a feeling that there is a general view that it would take that to get the attention necessary to put the resources we need into elections, whether it's outreach or just administration. And so I think the best thing people here is to advocate to policyholders and policymakers to say, hey, this is a bigger deal. This is not an elections thing. This is it's a Department of Revenue thing. It's a county commissioner thing. It is your issue. And then the only plug I would make is really being an election worker. Or also consider voting in advance. We have advance applications where you can set it, forget it kind of thing to do it by mail. And to advocate people that is one way, voting by mail is one way to get around the shifting of polling places, and it makes it about as easy as possible to vote. So that's the biggest thing I would suggest that people could go out and proclaim.
Let me just wrap this up by saying we heard a little talk about the ratification of the Kansas Constitution in 92 and 96, 2000. I talked about Bush versus Gore, but we did not talk about one of the great legacies in Kansas in voting, and that was extending the franchise to women. And that happened. We were one of the first states in America to do that in Kansas, and so that does show that the people of this state understand the importance of extending that to all Americans, including 100 years ago, women who were denied the right to vote across this country. So give Kansas a big round of applause for that, I guess. And again, let's say thank you to our panel. They did a great job. This can be an emotional issue.